Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the Art with World. Today we have a very interesting discussion about Kafi, which is a very popular form of poetry in Punjab, Saraiki areas and Sindh. And we have a very distinguished guest with us, AYESHA LATIF, who teaches English literature at Comsets University, Islamabad, and conducting her research on Kafi as a popular genre of poetry in South Asia. Welcome to our show, AYESHA.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
Okay, and just to start our discussion, I would like to ask you about what are origins of Kafi and how you define this popular form of poetry.
Yes, since we're going to be using this expression over and over and over again, so to sort of define the term, it's essential to know that the word Kafi perhaps derives from the word Kavita or Kavya, and which is classical Sanskrit poetry, which is based in India, and we're talking about the pre-partition India. And so I'm going to be referring it to South Asia. So we have South Asian poetry, and the term usually designated for the classical Sanskrit form of poetry is Kavya. The word Kafi, some of the scholars conjecture, that arrives from, or that originates from Kavya. And Kavya is a poem. It's poetry in general. Kafi is a poem. It's a short poem, and it has a huge part, or it has a huge contribution to the larger Punjabi literary tradition. So to begin with, the audience, the viewers should just know that Kafi is a name of a poem which is structured in a very, very simple way, and you associate the word Kafi with the poetry of the Sufi Punjabi poets, and that is Shah Hussain and Bulle Shah. Okay.
I was reading somewhere that Kafi is also derived from love's kami, which is calm, means pleasure. Is it true, or it is just another
Interestingly, we can only sort of conjecture on the origins of the word, and this goes, this is the same for the genre or the form of poetry that we'll be discussing at length.
Right.
So yes, perhaps the word derives from different languages or language sources, and one of the closest sort of conjectures is that it is also connected to the Arabic word kafiya, which means rhyme, which is a sort of a repetition. And this is again, this connects with the poem, because these poems in the Kafi are very, very rhythmical. And they're meant to be sung, they're meant to be performed. So you have to sort of link them with the oral tradition of poetry.
You basically teach English literature. How it interested you to take this deep research into this form of poetry?
Yeah, I mean, as a PhD student, when I began with the coursework, my focus, my area of focus was completely different, but it did shift entirely. I think it was mainly because one of the teachers inspired us to look into the regional forms of poetry. And we were doing some comparative study of some English poetic forms with the more like localized known Urdu forms. And therein, the term Kafi originated. And because we were looking at the poetry or the poetic landscape, so I remember, being sort of struck by this very appealing term, Shah Hussein's Kafi, and works in, the Kafi form or poem. And therein, somehow this idea sprouted that there needs to be some kind of work, some kind of study on Kafi. And unfortunately, we don't find many literature, English literature students or scholars or experts looking into regional works. And this is perhaps what inspired me.
Okay, that's great. Coming back to our subject again, could you share with us what are the important themes which recur in Kafi form?
Okay, so having defined or roughly sort of, you know, having described the idea of what is a Kafi, now we're talking about poetry, we're talking about poetic form that is particularly shaped by the oral tradition. And by oral tradition, we understand that it's connected, it's sort of, you know, transmitted from the word of mouth.
Yeah.
So bringing in the themes is, yes, it's very interesting to see that, you know, when we talk about the themes in the Kafi, the very poetic landscape is filled with the ideas of, or, you know, the ideas around how ordinary common people lived
day-to-day things.
In the more like the pre-modern and the early modern times.
Okay.
So what these poets, when you talk about Shah Hussain as the pioneer of this particular genre, what he brings in is the Punjabi culture, the domain of the household, the domestic sphere. And what is so peculiarly sort of interesting about it is that most of the poems in the Kafi, and which rounds about to around 157 to 160, depending on the different variations in the text available to us now, what we find is that most of the poems are concentrated on you know, bringing in this very, very center of the household, and which is the women-centric place, Atan, the Tarinjan. So what, when you look at the Kafis, most of them are shaped as sort of conversations, or sometimes a woman speaking out or expressing her feelings about a certain situation. And so much so that the most recurring themes or the patterns found are related to their everyday activities, which consisted of grinding grains on a chakki, weaving, spinning cloth on the spinning wheel. So you know, throughout Shah Hussein's poetry, you find another, you know, very important voice is that the woman or the girl or the female sort of central character in a poem is shown also to contemplate on either the future or the present. And what is most concerning to her is the prospect of her getting married and then being, you know, and leaving her parents' abode. So these sort of expressions, these ideas are time and again, you know, repeated in Shah Hussein's Kafi.
And it also, I guess what I understand, it talks the poetry is also about love and longing and desire. Like Shah Hussein's Kafi, Main bhi jana jhok rajandi. I mean, she wants to go to the place where Ranja or her beloved lives. Or, I mean, telling about personal pains as well, like Maini mein kinu akha dard vichhode da hali, that, oh my mother, who should I tell the pain of separation, all that. So, of course, you very rightly pointed out that it tells about day-to-day things, but it has a large canvas. It also talks about, I think, about love and longing. What do you say?
Oh yes, if we start sort of, you know, delayering these poems, what we find, one of the most characteristic qualities of these works is that most of them are put across in the persona of a female,
Yeah.
and the male poets take over this, you know, female persona, and sometimes, and rather quite often, it is the folklore characters. For instance, you've just mentioned Heer, who's echoing her pain of separation from Ranja.
Okay.
And you know, this is poetically shaped by Shah Hussain in very, very simple language. So what this feminine voice does is that it expresses the deepest human emotions, which are so very universal, in the shape of the Kafi. And of course, that is what transpires, is that there's this desire, there's this longing, there's this echo of, you know, suffering for love, and even sometimes the everyday joyfulness of a common person's life. So yes, these are basically very, very resonant of the basic human emotions, like you've said.
Okay. And maybe we can also discuss like resistance against different forms of oppression, which appears in, I think, all these Kafi poets, or even all maybe Punjabi poets as well. Like oppression against caste system, oppression against class system, things like that. Would you have some comments on
so
that?
definitely, because you're bringing in a very, very important point, and something that will come down when we look at the way the whole genre gets sort of molded and transformed, and up until the contemporary poets, and who we are going to definitely talk about, Mushtaq Sufi and Sayyid Najm Hussain later. But yes, Shah Hussain does put in this, you know, subtle tone of resistance, and that is then, you know, later taken over by the next 18th century poet, Bulle Shah. And there's a lot of polemical sort of charge, a lot of political resistance that Bulle Shah is going to bring forth in his works. So when we talk about the very founding father of the genre, Shah Hussain, we definitely find this, this voice that is trying to sort of resist the binaries, the categorizations that divide humans and human beings.
We just referred to Najm Hussain Sayyid, and I think I should mention his drama Takht Lahore, which is about actually rebellion of Dullah Bhatti against Mughal King Akbar, but there is also a mention, and a very important mention of Shah Hussain as well, who is kind of supporting his resistance movement against the king. I mean, basically it symbolizes his resistance against oppression and all other things which local people suffered at that time. So I think you are very rightly saying that Shah Hussain was quite aware of situation around him, and he took the side of the people against oppression, right?
Yeah, you know, it reminds me of Shafqat Tanveer Mirza's comment where he says that, you know, since Dullah Bhatti was Shah Hussein's contemporary, as far as we know about some of the biographical details of these poets, Dullah Bhatti was a warrior and a poet, and he was sort of martyred, I would put it this way, or, you know, he was defeated by one of Akbar's a very important general in his time, and Shah Hussain was able to sort of, you know, save himself from the situation. So in a way, Shafqat Tanveer Mirza says that, if Dullah Bhatti actually wages a war against the oppressive regime of his time, we find that Shah Hussain does it through his poetic work. So there's a definite strain, an echo of how they looked at the scenario in terms of the common people and the common people suffering under any form of oppression. So Shah Hussain voices that in his poetry. He talks about, in his poetry, the plights, particularly felt by the peasant class, the farming class. So, as a poet, he always associated himself with the lowest of the low in the society. And yes, therein you find this sometimes interesting sort of contrast, where he puts in that how people living in palaces and mansions have their lives apparently all together, and they think that the poor are unable to enjoy everyday life. However, both are damned in the sense that they aren't aware enough of the ephemerality of life in itself.
Before we discuss Bulle Shah, I think maybe we can, if you would like to share some of Shah Hussein's line with us.
Yes,
with our viewers.
Definitely. If you'd allow me to read out some of the English translations as well.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And I'd apologize for my not so accurate Punjabi accent. So, like I said, that the raw material that Shah Hussain takes for his poetry is the everyday life. And we're looking at the most, sort of repeated metaphor, symbol in his poetry, something that he reworks in so many of the Kafi poems. That is charkha. So here the refrain, the charkha mera rangda rang lal. Je vad charkha te vad pachi, maa pya mere sar te rakhi. Kahe Hussain fakir sai, har dam naam sambhal.
Wow. Beautiful.
And if you look at the translation, these translations are from Muzaffar Ghafar's work. Colored as my spinning wheel, it is dyed red. One of the favorites, one of the favorite colors for so many reasons in Shah Hussain. If the spinning wheel is big, so is the basket. On my head, my parents put the casket. So what do you find? There's also this, proto-feminist strain streak over here, where the woman is almost complaining that she's been given this burden, burden to spin the wheel, to do this work by her parents, or it comes in the legacy. And just to give an example of how Bulle Shah creates a parallel poem.
Please.
But there's this line where again spinning wheel or the act of spinning cloth has been sort of repeated. Here Bulle Shah says, girl, look to your spinning, the new crop is in, take it for scouring and then sit down to spin and spin and spin.
Wow, interesting, very interesting. You have just mentioned Bulle Shah, and I was coming to Bulle Shah. Tell us something about Bulle Shah's poetry and his times, and what value addition he did to Kafi.
We're sort of, jumping off to Bulle Shah.
Not jumping, we are just
kind of, trying to sort of overview the poems in the Kafi in a very sort of skim through them or a quick way. Yes, so we have 16th century Shah Hussain who provided us the or the Punjabi tradition, the form and the genre, the basic mold of the form of these poems. So what we find is that almost around in 18th century, that Bulle Shah appears. And Bulle Shah has a very, very renowned poet, you know, even in the contemporary times, and deservingly so, because he's been called as a lyrical genius. He almost liberates the Kafi from its previous form.
How?
In a way that there are changes in the structure, in the form, and there are definite changes in the tenor and the tone of the poems. In a way, you know, Tawfiq Rafat, whose translations I will be sort of referring to, he puts it that, you know, Bulle Shah is not only frees the Kafi from its form, rather he introduces a very unapologetic sort of tone in it. Sayyid Najm Hussain says that when Bulle Shah deploys this form, it becomes a dramatic song. And it's like a miniature drama when you read these poems. So a single poem has tones that finally converge to a single meaning. And just to give you an instance of that, there are lines where he strikingly sounds that emotional experience. And it's almost, you know, this voice is asking someone to do something, to do the daily grind in a very, very critical way. Kar kattan wal dehan kore. And there's this, you know, repetition. Attend to your spinning wheel. Attend to your spinning. Tu sadda na peke rehna hai, na paas amri de bhena hai.
Wow.
How long do you think you are going to stay with your parents? Sit indulgent by your mother's side, will you? Kar kattan wal dehan kore. So, you know, in this play of the mother-daughter scene, or perhaps this is the mother's voice who's chiding the daughter to look at her daily chore of spinning the cloth on the spinning wheel. There's another one which is so very interesting, and it will just give this is also to give your audience an idea, flavor of how Bulle Shah can change the tone with the same sort of expressions in another Kafi, and another poem, and where, you know, there is this poetic voice that says, Kat kure na vat kure, challi la bharote ghat kure, tere babul gande paya, din thode te cha mangaya. Now over here, there's this voice that's asking the girl to stop spinning. She says, the voice says, do not spin, and do not spin, my girl. Wind up the coils and pile them in your basket. And what is the reason? Because now you have to prepare. You're prepared. Your father has decided to wed you off. And now you should just abandon the work right now and get prepared to leave the place, leave the house. So, you know, there are different occasions that Bulle Shah brings in, and the subtlety, that slowness, or perhaps in some of the Shah Hussein's work, where you find sort of undertones of that anti-caste, anti-class theme, become very, very sort of prominent in Bulle Shah. So this is another way of looking at Bulle Shah. Bulle Shah has been sort of put as, or categorized as, in the category of rebel poets. Because what he says it so very bluntly. And just to give an idea to the audience of when we say that why and how blunt he is, he even condemns intellectual knowledge, and something very interesting to talk about and to reason as in why he does that. Ilmo bas kari o yaar, ikko alif tere darkar, ilm na aave vich shumar, jandi umar nahi etabar, ikko alif tere darkar, ilmo bas kariyo yaar. Enough of learning, friend. One A can bring an end. You studied night and day while life is ticking away. So what Bulle Shah is actually doing is that he's discrediting all worldly knowledge. He's discrediting it also for the pursuit of the more humane, the instinctual side of humans, something that we let go of.
Yeah, but many people differ with this as well. I mean, learning is also a humane thing. And
is it?
Civilization, yeah, why not?
Okay.
And civilization grows with learning. But I think he's more of talking of emphasizes on your own learning, experiential learning, existential experience, I think. That's some people say like
See, the way I look at these poets and I will sort of argue is that these poets are the poets of the common ordinary people. Okay? You have to keep that in mind, that when you are an intellectual, you have actually sort of, you've tried to, it's a conscious way of positioning yourself differently. And this is something that Shah Hussain and Bulle Shah, or whom we know as the Sufi Punjabi poets, what they do is that they definitely choose to categorize or to put themselves in the shoes of the common people, the ordinary folk.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'm a huge admirer of Bulle Shah, by the way, and he has so clearly taken sides with the masses. He was against caste system. His very famous lines, Bulle nu samjhawan aiya, behna te pajaiya. I mean, Bulleh's sisters were asking him to dissociate from others who do not belong to the same high caste where Bulle Shah belongs to. But he says, no, if someone thinks like that, they should leave me. And then he was very loud and very vocal about human liberty, freedom, and humanity. And he appreciated diversity and lived like that. That's great. I mean, there were two great poets we have just discussed, Bulle Shah and Shah Hussain. And I think Khwaja Ghulam Farid, which comes much later, he has also taken Kafi to another level. I mean, sublimity of his poetry is just one can enjoy. He talked of nature, he talked of about love, he talked about longing, he talked about the desert, Rohi desert, which was just the area he lived around. And maybe you also might have heard which Rohi de Rahandiyan, Nazuk Nazuk Jetiyan. Can you just tell about
okay. Before we sort of, talk about Khwaja Ghulam Farid, let me again sort of put this out that, when we talk about Khwaja Ghulam Farid, we're sort of stepping into a completely new direction in a lot of ways. First, linguistically, there are going to be a lot of changes because Khwaja Ghulam Farid belonged to the southern Punjab. And he originated, he basically belonged to Sindh and migrated at some point to southern Punjab. So the dialects sort of get very, very mixed up. You find a different quality of sound, a different kind of, different kinds of expressions in his works. But yes, there's a definite expansion in the poetic landscape of the Kafi. What he is bringing in the Kafi is the romance and the desert landscape and the folklore characters from Sindh and Balochistan. So what it is shaping is that it's shaping the Kafi in a new way. And I have some of the pieces are particularly very, very evocative of this desert imagery, and they're very, very beautiful in another on another level entirely. These exquisite, playful girls in the desert they dwell. The line that you just mentioned previously, which ruhi di rendiyan, nazik nazo jattiyan, rati karan shikar dile de, dina vilodan mattiyan, and which is, when put in a sort of a translation, these lines, refer to these exquisite, playful girls in the desert they dwell. At night, they hunt hearts. Daytime, at churning pitchers, they excel. And then there's another one where he's bringing in a very, very evocative landscape imagery. And there's this trope of this foreigner, of this lover who's bound to go to the foreign lands, which we call in our Desi language Pardesi. So the Pardesi, the expression is used over here in this Kafi, where Khwaja Ghulam Farid says, Pardesi yara va purab di, savan mi barsat diwari, phog phulli khip phulle. So beloved outlander, the east wind blows softly, cloudburst, showers, monsoons return, bushes blossom, shrubs bloom. This is one of the most visually appealing works in the Kafi. And the imagery, as you could see, it changes over here. And it's not the Punjabi territory, rather not the fertile grounds of Punjab or even the arid parts of Punjab. This is more like, an expansive desert where all these seasonal changes are taking place. And then, Khwaja Ghulam Farid, he weaves in all this imagery within his works.
You very rightly pointed out that he talked about the desert and the seasonal changes. His very famous Kafi is Pilu Pakiyani Auchulu Raliyar. The women are calling each other that now this is the time, Pilu, which is a local fruit, let's go and collect it. And it's remind me of another great poet of our times, Hussain, whose poetry was also sung in the same tone as this Kafi of Ghulam Farid was sung, which is Naveyan Patran de Aur Rang Banaiye. It's the new, it was a very famous poetry sung by many a singer in Punjab. So I remember Najm Hussain Sayyid Sahab. I mean, let's just talk about him as well at this point. And way back, like 2-3 decades before, when I was Lahore, I used to attend his Sangat, weekly Sangat meetings. It was, I think it was a very regularly conducted meeting. Everyone used to read out Punjabi poetry and they used to discuss, and then it was sung as well collectively by some singer over there. And then most of my knowledge about Punjabi poetry came from in those meetings. I think in that time most of Punjabi intellectuals were reinterpreting their poetry, and they were reinterpreting meanings in our old folklore, in Heer Waris Shah, in Kafis of Shah Hussain and Bulle Shah. Najm Sayyid Sahab, Mushtaq Sufi, all that, they contributed a lot to Punjabi poetry. Would you like to say something about that?
Thank you for putting it across. This is really important, because this connects us back to our basic poetic tradition, as in to look at these pieces of work as poetry before we sort of categorize them or label them as mystical or devotional or entirely in the sort of ambit of Sufi poetry. Because what they're doing, what Shah Hussain, what Bulle Shah, what Khwaja Ghulam Farid, the three poets that we've been talking about, what they're doing is to create these masterpieces by taking very, very simple language, but then the way they piece it together, the way they put it together has such layers to it that you keep on trying to interpret and reinterpret it. So when you look at these pieces, you can sort of interpret them, you can choose to see them as, sort of reflecting the everyday lives of the common people. And perhaps, yes, you can sort of relate it to the more esoteric or mystically inclined interpretations in these works. Okay. So the spinning wheel or the grinding flowers, this flower activity, this constant churning of the wheel can be interpreted as the daily grind that, as humans undergo or ordinary people undergo every day. Or it can be, taken as zikr, the act of meditation, where you keep on sort of repeating a certain expression to reach a level of consciousness where you connect with the divinity. So one of the ways that I look at the ways that these works are reworked or reinterpreted is also that there's so much more to explore in these works, rather than looking at some of the other pieces of literature that have been canonized. There's a lot of room to go back and find and see the regional poets and their works and what they offer to us.
Well, and I would also say Rifat Abbas, another very important poet in Saraiki. He has written extremely beautiful kafis and raised very relevant subjects in his poetry. But coming back to Kafi, I would like to discuss with you and hear from you a very significant aspect of Kafi poetry, and that is feminine voice. Most and perhaps all the Kafi poets have used feminine voice. Why it is so, and what are the reasons?
And interestingly, without giving any sort of forward or sort of explanation to why they're doing so. And it's very hard. It's made it, sort of complicated for the scholars to sort of, sort of deconstruct as to why the feminine voice or why the feminine persona. Though it makes so much sense when you look back at the Indic poetic tradition, the Bhakti tradition, for instance, where the Bhagat poets, they preferred the feminine voice over the masculine voice. So there's this sort of guess, there's this hypothesis that perhaps the Bhakti tradition had sort of fused into the local traditions in a way that the Punjabi sort of poets, they continue with that. So they continue to bring in that feminine voice and persona. But what are the implications of, we also need to keep in mind that, when poetic tradition is sort of put or rendered in the feminine voice as opposed to the male voice or the more masculinized sort of tone, what happens is that it comes very close to the visceral, to the emotional, to the aspect where you can connect with the sentiments, because many of the kafis bring out, express, or they're basically centered on expressions of, like we said, longing and foreboding and joy and playfulness, and these expressions sort of find their intensity in a woman's voice. And perhaps the poets, to put it in a more radicalized way, they were radicals of their own times. But the male poets, by using the feminine voice, transgressed the gender boundaries. There's a connection to this idea of gender fluidity, perhaps, and this is what they were trying to show or bring in their works, the aspect of gender fluidity, something that we now understand as part of the feminist discourse.
Right. It's very interesting. We had a very, very interesting discussion. There were many other points which we wanted to discuss, like Sindhi Kafi and music in Kafi.
Yes.
But I think
very important. Before we sort of wrap up or we close, there must be another program. I mean, you can call in some musicians, you can call in some singers, because they've played a huge role in sort of circulation of these poetic bits, this genre. And we find a lot of contemporary musicians still, taking up the same, some of the Punjabi poetic tradition, and then, they're the ones who have contributed to the dissemination of Punjabi Sufi poetry or Punjabi poetry.
Okay. It's very interesting, and I think there's a huge resource of learning we can learn from our poets. But considering that most of our younger generation does not know Punjabi, and most of them are taught in English medium schools, so how would they carry forward this legacy, such a rich legacy we have? That remains a question which needs another session of discussion, I think. But I think we could discuss some very important points in our discussion. I must say that you brought in so many important subjects in our discussions. Thank you very much for being with us. And viewers, that is all from today. See you next time.